Tom Miller, a 53-year-old school janitor, was mopping the empty hallway on a cold November evening when 7-year-old Emma Hayes came running toward him, tears streaming down her face, screaming that someone was hurting her mother in the parking lot. Without hesitation, Tom dropped his mop and followed the child into the darkness, never knowing that the woman he was about to save was Catherine Hayes, the billionaire CEO whose company owned the very school where he worked. And that his single act of courage would not only save her life but would also transform his own in ways he could never have imagined, proving that sometimes the most powerful people in the world are saved by those the world overlooks. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Tom Miller's hands had long ago memorized the weight of a mop handle. At 53 years old, his fingers were permanently curved from decades of gripping brooms, buckets, and cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Elementary School hummed their familiar evening song as he pushed his yellow mop bucket down the silent hallway, the wheels squeaking rhythmically against the polished linoleum. This was his world after the children went home, after the teachers packed their bags and hurried to their own lives. This was when the school belonged to him. He moved through the empty classrooms like a careful guardian, wiping down desks, straightening chairs, ensuring everything would be perfect for the next morning. There was a quiet dignity in his work, a pride that nobody else seemed to notice or care about. His worn gray uniform hung loose on his thin frame. His work boots were scuffed and resoled twice, but his eyes, pale blue and gentle, still held a warmth that made the children smile when they passed him in the halls. They called him Mr. Tom. Some of the younger ones hugged his legs. He always had a kind word, a soft joke, a gentle reminder to tie their shoelaces so they wouldn't trip. The teachers barely acknowledged him. To them, he was part of the furniture, as invisible as the water fountains and bulletin boards. But Tom didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that worth wasn't measured by recognition. His late wife Sarah had taught him that. 3 years had passed since cancer took her from him. 3 years of coming home to an empty apartment that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. He kept her photograph on the nightstand, next to the lamp with the broken switch he kept meaning to fix. Every morning at 4:30, he woke in the darkness and made coffee in the pot they'd received as a wedding gift 28 years ago. He worked his first shift at a warehouse from 5 until noon, then came straight to the school to work until 9 at night. 2 jobs, 7 days a week. It was the only way to keep the lights on, to pay the rent on his studio apartment, to afford the simple meals he ate standing at the kitchen counter. But he never complained. Complaining wouldn't bring Sarah back. Complaining wouldn't change anything. So he worked, and he cleaned, and he found small moments of peace in the silence of empty hallways and the satisfaction of a job done well. The school after hours had its own rhythm, its own personality. His footsteps echoed against the walls covered with children's artwork and motivational posters. The smell of pine cleaning solution mixed with chalk dust and the lingering scent of cafeteria food. He knew every corner, every stubborn stain, every squeaky floorboard. Room 107 had a window that never quite closed. Room 214 always smelled like crayons. The gymnasium floor required extra care, a specific pattern of mopping that prevented streaks. Tom treated each space with respect, as if the classrooms were sacred ground where young minds grew and flourished. Tonight was a Tuesday in November, cold and dark outside. Through the windows he could see his reflection, a thin man growing old, pushing a mop bucket like he'd done for 30 years. His arthritis ached in the November chill. His lower back sent sharp reminders with every twist and bend. But his hands never stopped moving. The hallway gleamed under his care, wet and shining in the fluorescent light. He hummed quietly to himself, an old tune Sarah used to sing while cooking dinner. The bucket sloshed. The mop swished. Everything was as it should be. Then he heard the scream. A child's scream, high and terrified, cutting through the silence like a knife. Tom's head snapped up. His heart lurched in his chest. The mop clattered to the floor. The little girl burst through the double doors at the end of the hallway like a hurricane of terror and desperation. Her navy blue school uniform jumper was twisted sideways, one white knee sock bunched around her ankle while the other had fallen completely off. Her blonde hair, which had probably been neatly braided that morning, now flew wild around her face. That face, small and pale and streaked with tears, was contorted in absolute panic. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated with fear, and her mouth hung open as sobs tore from her throat. She was maybe 7 years old, tiny and fragile, and she was running toward Tom like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly turned to chaos. Tom dropped to his knees instantly, ignoring the sharp protest from his joints. His heart hammered against his ribs. The child nearly collided with him, her small hands clutching at his uniform shirt. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between wails, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. Tom's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was she hurt? Was there a fire? Had something happened to another child? He reached out carefully, placing his weathered hands on her small shoulders, trying to ground her, to bring her back from whatever horror had sent her running. His voice came out steady despite the fear rising in his own chest. He spoke softly, the same gentle tone he'd used with his own nieces when they were small. The tone Sarah had always said could calm any frightened creature. He told the little girl to look at him, to breathe with him. In through the nose. Out, out, out through the mouth. In and out. Slowly. She tried to follow, her chest heaving, tears still streaming down her flushed cheeks. Her nose was running and her lips trembled uncontrollably. Tom kept breathing with her, kept his eyes locked on hers, kept his voice calm and sure even though alarm bells were screaming in his head. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, she managed to gulp in enough air to speak. The words came out broken and desperate. Bad men, hurting, mommy, parking lot. The sentences barely connected, but Tom understood enough. His blood turned to ice. Someone was attacking this child's mother outside, right now, while he stood here in the safety of the school. His protective instinct, the one that had made him walk old ladies across streets and stop fights between teenagers, roared to life. He asked quickly if she'd called 911. Emma shook her head violently, more tears spilling over. Her mother's phone was in the car and she didn't know how to use the big phone in the office. Tom's mind clicked through the situation with surprising clarity. He couldn't leave this terrified child alone, but he couldn't waste time either. Every second mattered. He pulled his own phone from his pocket with one hand while keeping the other on Emma's shoulder. He told her firmly but kindly that she needed to run to the principal's office right now and lock the door. He pointed down the hallway toward the administrative wing. She needed to hide under the desk and not come out until he or a police officer came to get her. Could she do that? Emma nodded, still sobbing but understanding the urgency in his voice. Tom squeezed her shoulder once, a promise that he would help, then released her. She took off running toward the office. Tom was already moving in the opposite direction, his thumb dialing 911 as his worn work boots pounded against the polished floor he'd just cleaned. He burst through the exit doors into the cold November night. The phone pressed to his ear, his heart in his throat, with no idea that he was running straight toward the most important moment of his entire life. The cold November air hit Tom's face like a slap, stealing his breath for a moment. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and his breath came out in white puffs as he ran across the concrete. The parking lot stretched out before him, a vast expanse of empty spaces illuminated by only 3 working streetlights that cast weak yellow pools across the asphalt. Most of the lot was swallowed in shadow. The school building behind him blazed with light. But out here, darkness reigned. His eyes adjusted quickly, scanning desperately for movement, for the little girl's mother, for the threat she'd described. Then he heard it, shouting, a woman's voice, sharp with terror and fury, and deeper male voices barking commands. Tom's gaze locked onto the far corner of the lot, where shadows moved violently near a gleaming black luxury sedan. 2 massive figures were dragging a woman toward a dark van parked nearby. Even from this distance, Tom could see she was fighting with everything she had, twisting and kicking, but the men outweighed her significantly. One had her by the arms, the other was trying to grab her legs. The woman's designer coat was half torn off her shoulders. Her desperate struggles were losing strength. Tom's heart slammed against his ribcage so hard he thought it might crack right through. His rational mind screamed at him that he was 53 years old, that his knees ached on good days and screamed on bad ones, that his hands were gnarled with arthritis and couldn't even open a jar without pain. He wasn't a fighter. He'd never thrown a punch in his life. He was just a janitor, a nobody, a man who cleaned up after other people and went home alone to a cold apartment. These men were professionals, dangerous, armed for all he knew. Running toward them was suicide. But his feet didn't stop moving. His legs carried him forward across the parking lot, faster than he'd run in years, his work boots slapping against the pavement. His thumb had already found the emergency call button on his phone. As he ran, the phone connected. A calm female voice answered, asking about the nature of his emergency. Tom's voice came out loud and clear, projecting across the parking lot even as he spoke into the phone. He shouted that there was an assault in progress, that men were trying to kidnap a woman, that he needed police immediately at Riverside Elementary School. The operator began asking questions, but Tom kept shouting, making sure his voice carried to the attackers. The two men heard him coming. Their heads whipped around in his direction. Tom was maybe 30 feet away now, close enough to see their faces twisted in surprise and anger, close enough to see the woman's terrified eyes, her bloodied lip, her hands clawing at her captor's arms. One of the men released the woman's legs and reached into his jacket. Tom's stomach dropped as he saw the glint of metal. A gun. The man pulled it out and leveled it in Tom's direction, his voice booming across the parking lot. He told Tom to back off, to walk away, to mind his own business if he wanted to keep breathing. Tom's entire body wanted to obey that command. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to run back to safety. His legs actually faltered for half a step, but then he thought of little Emma's tear-streaked face, of her desperate plea, of the trust she'd placed in him. He thought of Sarah, who'd always said that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what was right, despite the fear. Tom didn't stop. He kept moving forward, his phone held high above his head like a shield. He shouted that the police were already on their way, that he was recording everything, that their faces were on camera, that they were done. His voice didn't waver even though his insides were liquid terror. The operator's voice in his ear was asking him to confirm details, but Tom just kept shouting, kept walking forward, kept his phone pointed at the men like a weapon, praying they couldn't see how badly his hands were shaking. The two men exchanged a rapid glance, their eyes meeting over the woman's struggling form. Tom could see the calculation happening in real time, could almost hear their thoughts racing. They looked at Tom, at his phone held high, at the empty parking lot that was suddenly not so empty, at their captive who'd become a liability. The man with the gun lowered it slightly, uncertainty flickering across his hard features. Tom kept coming, kept his voice loud and authoritative, repeating like a mantra that police were on their way, that everything was recorded, that their faces were captured, that running now was their only chance. He had no idea if his phone was actually recording, hadn't even thought to activate the camera, but they didn't know that. The bluff was working. He could see doubt creeping into their expressions. The woman, Catherine, felt their grip loosen just a fraction as they focused on the approaching threat. She'd been fighting since they'd grabbed her near her car, since they'd appeared from nowhere while she was buckling Emma into the back seat. Her arms ached. Her lip was split and bleeding, but she hadn't given up, hadn't stopped resisting. Now, with their attention divided, she gathered every ounce of strength left in her body and wrenched herself sideways with a desperate twist. The man holding her arms lost his grip. Catherine stumbled, nearly fell, then found her footing and ran. She ran toward the crazy janitor who was either the bravest or most foolish man she'd ever encountered. Her expensive heels, one broken, made her gait uneven. Her torn coat flapped behind her, but she ran. The men cursed, their voices sharp and vicious in the cold air. They made a split-second decision. The one with the gun shoved it back into his jacket, and both men sprinted for the van. Doors slammed. The engine roared to life. Tires squealed against the pavement, leaving black marks as the van accelerated out of the parking lot. Just as they disappeared around the corner, sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, growing brighter, growing closer. Catherine reached Tom, and her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the cold pavement, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her whole body shaking with shock and adrenaline. Tom was beside her instantly, dropping to his knees despite the pain that shot through them. His phone was still in his hand, the operator's voice still asking questions. He told her quickly that the suspects had fled, that the victim was safe, that ambulance was needed. Then he focused entirely on the woman before him. He asked gently if she was badly hurt, his eyes scanning for injuries. Catherine shook her head, unable to speak yet, just breathing, trying to convince herself she was alive and safe. Tom noticed everything about her, even through his own racing heartbeat. Her coat, though torn, was clearly expensive. Some designer label he didn't recognize. Diamond earrings caught the distant streetlight, sparkling even in the darkness. Her clothing, her jewelry, the sleek black sedan behind them, all spoke of wealth Tom couldn't imagine. She clutched a designer handbag to her chest like a lifeline, her knuckles white. Blood trickled from her split lip down her chin. Police cars screeched into the parking lot, 3 of them, surrounding them with flashing lights and the crackle of radios. Officers poured out, shouting commands, establishing a perimeter, and then another sound cut through everything else. A child's scream, but different this time. Not terror, but relief and desperate love. Emma burst from the school building, her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. She was crying, but the word that tore from her throat was the most beautiful sound in the world. Mommy, Mommy, Mommy! Catherine looked up, tears flooding her eyes, and opened her arms. Emma crashed into her mother, and they both collapsed together onto the cold pavement, holding each other, sobbing, rocking back and forth. Catherine's hands ran over Emma's hair, her face, checking frantically that her daughter was unharmed. Emma buried her face in her mother's neck, her small body shaking with sobs. Tom stood slowly, his knees protesting, and stepped back to give them space. Officers surrounded him, asking questions, but he barely heard them. He just watched the mother and daughter clinging to each other, watched them piece themselves back together in the flashing red and blue light, and felt something break open in his chest that had been locked tight since Sarah died. The parking lot transformed into a scene of organized chaos. 4 police cars now, their lights painting the school building in alternating red and blue. An ambulance arrived within minutes, its siren winding down as paramedics jumped out with their equipment. Officers spread out, some photographing tire marks, others searching for evidence, all of them talking into radios clipped to their shoulders. The cold November wind picked up, carrying voices and the metallic smell of exhaust. Tom found himself surrounded by 2 officers and a detective in a long coat who'd introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. They guided Tom toward one of the police cars, away from the chaos, and began asking questions. Tom's hands were still shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. But his mind was clear. He walked them through everything step by step, Emma running into the hallway, her terrified words, his decision to help, running outside, seeing the attackers, calling 911, approaching despite the weapon. He spoke clearly, precisely, the way someone does when they want to make absolutely sure they're understood. Detective Ramirez asked about the phone recording. Tom admitted sheepishly that he hadn't actually been recording, that he'd been bluffing. But he'd had the 911 call active the whole time. The detective's eyebrows rose and something like respect flickered across his weathered face. He told Tom that was some quick thinking, that his bluff had likely saved that woman's life, that most people would have run the other way, or at best called from safety. Tom didn't know what to say to that. He'd just done what needed doing. Nearby, the paramedics had coaxed Catherine into the back of the ambulance. They were checking her vitals, shining lights in her eyes, cleaning the cut on her lip. Emma sat pressed against her mother's side, refusing to let go. Catherine answered their questions mechanically, but her eyes kept drifting over to where Tom stood with the detective. Her gaze held something Tom couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also a kind of wonder, as if she was looking at something she'd thought didn't exist. Detective Ramirez followed her gaze and asked Tom casually if he knew who the woman was. Tom shook his head. Should he? The detective seemed genuinely surprised. That's Catherine Hayes, he explained, as in Hayes Industries. One of the wealthiest people in the entire state, maybe the region. Her company owned hundreds of businesses, properties, including this very school. She was worth billions with a B. This wasn't a random attack. This was almost certainly a kidnapping attempt, ransom-motivated, probably planned for weeks. Tom felt the ground shift under his feet. Billions, CO, Hayes Industries. He'd seen that name on the small plaque by the school's entrance, the one that said the building renovation was sponsored by Hayes Industries Foundation. He'd cleaned around that plaque 1,000 times and never thought much about it, and he'd just charged at armed men trying to kidnap the woman who owned everything around him, including probably his job. He'd risked his life without knowing, without caring who she was. He would have done the same if she'd been anyone. A waitress, a teacher, a stranger. It hadn't mattered. It still didn't matter. But the realization hit him hard anyway. Detective Ramirez was watching him carefully, reading his reaction. The detective nodded slowly, as if Tom had just confirmed something important without saying a word. That's when Catherine approached. The paramedics had finished their examination, declared her stable, but urged her to go to the hospital for a full check. She'd refused. She'd cleaned the blood from her face, and someone had draped a blanket around her shoulders over her torn coat. Emma walked beside her, hand locked in her mother's hand, not willing to be separated by even an inch. Catherine moved with purpose despite everything she'd just endured. She walked straight toward Tom, and when she stood before him, the detective and officers instinctively stepped back, giving them space. Tom suddenly felt very aware of his stained janitor uniform, his worn boots, his rough hands. But Catherine's eyes held his, and in them he saw something that made his breath catch. They were green, he noticed for the first time, a striking green even in the harsh lights of the emergency vehicles. And they were filled with tears. Catherine Hayes stood before Tom Miller, and despite everything, despite the torn designer coat and the bruise forming on her cheekbone and the dried blood at the corner of her mouth, she carried herself with an unmistakable grace. It wasn't the haughty bearing of someone who knew their bank account could buy small countries. It was something deeper, something innate. She stood straight despite the trembling in her limbs, met his eyes directly despite the tears pooling in her own, held her daughter close despite her own need for comfort. Emma pressed against her mother's side, one small hand twisted in Catherine's coat, the other rubbing at her tear-swollen eyes. Catherine reached out and took Tom's weathered hand in both of hers. Her hands were soft. He noticed distantly. The hands of someone who'd never scrubbed floors or hauled boxes or worked until their palms cracked and bled. But they gripped his calloused fingers with surprising strength. Her voice trembled when she spoke, emotion cracking through what he suspected was usually perfect composure. She told him that he'd saved her life, that without him, Emma would have lost her mother tonight, that she could never repay what he'd done, that there weren't words big enough or adequate enough to express her gratitude. Tom felt his face flush hot despite the cold. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze, with the way everyone around them had gone quiet to listen. He pulled his hand back gently and told her, his voice rough, that he'd just done what anyone would do, that it wasn't anything special, that he was glad she was safe. Catherine's eyes flooded with fresh tears. She shook her head slowly, deliberately. Her voice came out stronger now, more certain. She told him that wasn't true, that most people would have called the police and stayed inside where it was safe, that most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem, that someone else would help, that getting involved was too dangerous. that he'd risked everything, had run toward men with weapons, had put his own life on the line for a complete stranger. That kind of courage, that kind of selfless humanity, was rare, precious. She'd spent her entire life surrounded by people, and she could count on one hand the number who would have done what he did. Tom didn't know what to say to that. He opened his mouth and closed it again, feeling completely out of his depth. Then Emma suddenly released her mother and wrapped her small arms around Tom's leg, pressing her tear-stained face against his worn work pants. Her voice was muffled but clear. She thanked him for saving her mommy. She said he was a hero. She said she loved him. Tom's heart, that tired muscle that had been so carefully guarded since Sarah's death, cracked wide open. He looked down at this tiny girl clinging to him, this child he'd never met before tonight, and felt something shift fundamentally inside his chest. His hand moved automatically to pat her blonde head. His touch, gentle, the same way he touched the students who skinned their knees or lost their lunch money, or just needed a kind word. He told her softly that her mommy was very brave, that she'd fought hard, that everything was going to be okay now. Emma looked up at him with absolute trust shining in her eyes. She reminded him of all the children he saw every day at school, the ones who still believed the world was good, who hadn't yet learned to be cynical or afraid. Catherine was watching this exchange with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. Something was happening behind those green eyes, some decision being made, some assessment being completed. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. She asked Tom for his name, his full name, and his contact information. She needed to be able to reach him. Tom hesitated. Something in him wanted to refuse, to slip away back into his invisible life, to avoid whatever came next. But Detective Ramirez was standing nearby, and the police would need his information anyway for their reports. And Catherine was looking at him with such earnest intensity that refusing felt impossible. So he told her, Tom Miller. He recited his phone number, the same one he'd had for 15 years because changing it felt like erasing another connection to Sarah. Catherine repeated it carefully, committing it to memory, then pulled out a phone that had somehow survived the attack and entered the information. She looked at him directly and promised they would speak again soon, that this wasn't over, that she needed to thank him properly. Tom nodded, not trusting his voice, and watched as paramedics gently guided Catherine and Emma back toward the ambulance for a final check before they could leave. Tom's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, the same as always, but his body felt like it had been hit by a truck. He'd finally left the police station just after midnight, having spent hours going over every detail of the attack for the official report, looking at photos of suspects in databases and signing statement after statement. He'd fallen into bed at 1 in the morning and managed maybe 3 hours of fitful sleep, filled with images of guns and terrified children and green eyes filled with tears. Every muscle in his body ached. His knees, which had hit the pavement multiple times, throbbed with each step. His hands were stiff, the arthritis aggravated by the cold and stress. But the warehouse shift didn't care about his exhaustion, and neither did the school. So he dragged himself out of bed, made his coffee in the dark, and went through the motions of his life. He skipped the warehouse, calling in sick for the first time in 2 years, and drove straight to Riverside Elementary, arriving an hour earlier than usual. He expected the building to be empty and silent, a place where he could lose himself in familiar work and try to process everything that had happened. Instead, he found Principal Davidson waiting for him in the main hallway. Margaret Davidson was a stern woman in her 60s who'd run the school for 15 years with an iron fist wrapped in bureaucratic procedure. Tom had worked under her for 8 years, and she'd probably spoken directly to him fewer than 10 times. Now she stood by the trophy case with an expression on her face that Tom couldn't quite decipher. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise, something in between that made him deeply uncomfortable. She told him good morning, in a tone that suggested the morning was anything but routine. Tom returned the greeting warily, waiting for whatever was coming. Mrs. Davidson explained that the local news had covered the incident last night. They'd mentioned a heroic janitor from Riverside Elementary who'd saved Catherine Hayes from a kidnapping attempt. The phone had been ringing since 6 in the morning with calls from parents, from the school board, from reporters wanting comments. Tom felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped the whole thing would just quietly go away, that he could return to his invisible life. Mrs. Davidson was still talking, saying something about how the school was proud, how this reflected well on their staff, how Tom's actions were commendable. Her words felt strange and formal, as if she was reading from a script she'd prepared. Throughout the morning, Tom tried to stick to his routine. He cleaned the front entrance, replaced paper towels in the bathrooms, wiped down the cafeteria tables before breakfast service. But teachers kept approaching him. Miss Peterson from 3rd grade called him a hero and asked if he was all right. Mr. Jackson from 5th grade shook his hand and said the school was lucky to have him. Even the secretary, Mrs. Chen, who'd worked at the front desk for a decade and barely acknowledged his existence, came to find him and told him what he'd done was incredible. Tom's face burned with embarrassment through every interaction. He mumbled the same response over and over. He'd just done what was right, what anyone should do. It wasn't anything special, but they kept coming, kept calling him a hero, kept looking at him with new eyes that saw him as something other than the invisible man who emptied their trash cans. It made his skin crawl. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want attention, didn't want his quiet life disrupted. By lunch, Tom escaped to the boiler room in the basement, the one place he knew no one would follow. He sat on an overturned bucket in the dim warmth, next to the ancient furnace that rumbled and hissed, and unwrapped the peanut butter sandwich he'd made that morning. The bread was a little stale. He ate mechanically, not tasting it. In the solitude, he finally allowed himself to think about Catherine Hayes. He wondered if she was all right, if the shock had worn off, or if she was still shaking. He wondered if little Emma had nightmares, if she'd been able to sleep at all. He hoped they had family around them, people to help them feel safe again. The image of Catherine's face kept returning to him. Those green eyes, the way she'd looked at him like he was something extraordinary when he was just a janitor who'd done the right thing. He thought about her promise that they'd speak again, but he didn't believe it. People like Catherine Hayes didn't maintain contact with people like Tom Miller. She lived in a different world, a world of boardrooms and mansions and private jets. He lived in a studio apartment with a broken lamp and ate stale sandwiches in boiler rooms. Their paths had crossed for one terrifying night, and now they'd diverge again forever. That was how the world worked. Tom finished his sandwich, crumpled the plastic wrap, and stood to return to work. He never expected to see Catherine or Emma Hayes again. 3 days passed in a strange blur. Tom returned to his routine, or tried to. He mopped floors and emptied trash cans and cleaned whiteboards covered in the day's lessons. But it wasn't the same. Students whispered when he walked by, pointing and nudging each other. First graders stared at him with open awe. Teachers smiled at him in the hallways. Really smiled. Like he was a colleague instead of the help. The local newspaper had run a story with the headline, "School Janitor Saves Billionaire CEO," and included a grainy photo of Tom from some old staff directory. His phone, which usually sat silent for days, had rung repeatedly with calls from reporters he didn't answer and distant relatives he hadn't heard from in years. He ignored all of it, kept his head down, focused on his work. By Thursday afternoon, the attention had started to fade. Life was returning to normal. Tom was grateful. He stood at the front entrance just after 3 o'clock, sweeping scattered leaves that students had tracked inside, when he heard the smooth purr of an expensive engine. His head came up instinctively. His stomach tightened with an old fear, a muscle memory of that night. A sleek black car was pulling up to the circular drive in front of the school. For a heartbeat, panic flared. But this car was different, longer. A town car, glossy and elegant, with tinted windows and chrome that gleamed in the afternoon Sunday. A driver in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear passenger door with practiced precision. Catherine Hayes emerged. Tom's breath caught in his throat. She looked completely different from the terrified, disheveled woman from the parking lot. She wore an elegant navy business suit that probably cost more than Tom made in 6 months. Her hair was styled perfectly. Diamond studs glinted at her ears. She moved with the confident grace of someone who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. She looked like power itself, like money and influence wrapped in human form, and then Emma stepped out behind her, wearing a pretty lavender dress with white tights and shiny black shoes. Her blonde hair was pulled back with a matching ribbon. She looked like a little princess. They walked toward the entrance together, Emma's hand in her mother's, and Tom stood frozen with his broom in his calloused hands, suddenly and painfully aware of his stained gray uniform and scuffed boots. Catherine's face broke into a warm smile when she saw him. Not the polished smile of a CEO at a charity gala, but something genuine and bright that reached her eyes. She greeted him by name, her voice carrying across the entrance hall. Tom felt his face flush. Several students and parents in the lobby turned to stare. He managed to stammer out a greeting, his tongue thick and awkward in his mouth. Catherine said she'd come to thank him properly. Tom's hands tightened on the broom handle. He told her quickly that it wasn't necessary, that she didn't need to do this, that he was just glad she and Emma were safe. His words tumbled over each other, desperate and uncomfortable. Catherine's expression softened, but her determination didn't waver. She insisted they needed to talk. She'd made arrangements with Mrs. Davidson to use one of the conference rooms. Would he spare her a few minutes? It wasn't a request from a billionaire CEO. It was a genuine plea from a woman who needed to say something important. Tom looked at Emma, who was gazing up at him with those trusting eyes, and found he couldn't refuse. He nodded, set his broom against the wall, and followed them deeper into the school. Mrs. Davidson appeared as if summoned, all professional courtesy and deference as she led them to the administrative conference room. Tom had cleaned this room 1,000 times but had never actually been inside it during the day, had never sat at the long polished table where important decisions were made. Now he stood awkwardly near the door while Catherine and Emma took seats on one side. Mrs. Davidson excused herself, closing the door behind her, and suddenly Tom was alone with them in the quiet room. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Catherine gestured to the chair across from her. Tom sat slowly, feeling completely and utterly out of his depth, like a fish that had been pulled from water and asked to breathe air. Catherine folded her hands on the table and looked at him with an intensity that made his heart race. She had something to say, and Tom had the sudden feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Catherine sat perfectly straight in the leather conference chair, her hands folded on the polished table, while Emma sat close beside her, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor. Tom sat across from them, his weathered hands resting awkwardly on his thighs, feeling like an imposter in a world that wasn't meant for him. The room smelled of furniture, polish, and coffee, familiar scents from his cleaning routine, but strange from this side of things. Catherine began to speak, her voice measured and thoughtful. She told Tom that she'd spent the past 3 days thinking about what had happened. Not just the attack itself, but everything surrounding it. The police had caught the men yesterday morning. They'd been professionals, hired by a business rival who'd been trying to leverage her through fear and intimidation. It was a corporate war that had turned violent, something her lawyers and security team were now handling. But that wasn't what kept her awake at night. Tom listened, his brow furrowed, not entirely understanding the world of corporate espionage she was describing, but following along as best he could. Catherine's voice grew softer, more personal. She explained that she'd spent her entire adult life, especially the past 10 years, since Hayes Industries exploded in value, surrounded by people who wanted something from her, employees who agreed with every decision because she signed their paychecks, executives who smiled to her face and plotted behind her back, friends who might be genuine or might just enjoy the access to private jets and exclusive parties her wealth provided. Every relationship in her life came with a question mark, a shadow of doubt. Did they like her or what she could do for them? Were they honest or just telling her what she wanted to hear? It was exhausting and isolating in ways that people without wealth could never understand. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. Then, 3 nights ago, a janitor she'd never met, a man who had no idea who she was, had run toward armed attackers without hesitation. Tom had risked his life, had put himself in danger for a complete stranger. Not because she was Catherine Hayes, CEO and billionaire, just because she was a person who needed help. That authenticity, that pure and uncomplicated goodness, was something she genuinely believed no longer existed in the world. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wanted to interrupt, to tell her she was making too much of it, that it wasn't that special. But something in her expression stopped him. She needed to say this. Emma reached over and took her mother's hand, a small gesture of support. Catherine squeezed back, gathering herself. She told Tom that what he'd done had shaken something loose inside her, had reminded her that there was still real humanity in the world, still people who acted from pure motive rather than calculation. It had given her hope she didn't know she'd lost. Tom's throat felt tight. He managed to say quietly that he'd just done what was right, what anyone decent would do. Catherine's eyes locked onto his. She told him that was exactly the point. He believed that. He genuinely believed everyone would have done the same. But they wouldn't have. Most people would have called the police and stayed inside. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their responsibility. Most people would have chosen safety over courage. But he hadn't. Then Catherine said something that made Tom's heart start pounding. She told him she wanted to reward him, not to pay him off or to discharge some obligation, but to genuinely change his life the way he'd saved hers. Tom immediately shook his head, his hands coming up in protest. He didn't want money. He didn't want anything. What he'd done wasn't for sale. Catherine had expected this response. She leaned forward slightly, her voice earnest and insistent. She explained that this wasn't about payment or transaction. It was about recognizing true character and honoring it. She'd spent 3 days thinking about how to do this right. How to offer help without insulting his dignity. She wanted to do something meaningful. Something that would make a real difference. Not just write a check and walk away. Tom sat frozen, torn between pride and the creeping realization that whatever she was about to offer might be something he desperately needed but could never ask for. Emma piped up suddenly, her young voice clear in the quiet room. She told Tom that her mommy wanted to make him happy like he made them safe. Catherine smiled at her daughter, then turned back to Tom with an expression of such genuine care that it made his chest ache. She asked him a simple question. What did he dream about? If he could do anything, be anything, what would it be? Tom's hands came up immediately, palms out, shaking his head before Catherine even finished her sentence. He told her firmly that he didn't want money or rewards, that what he'd done wasn't for sale, that accepting payment would somehow cheapen it. He'd helped because someone needed help, because it was the right thing to do, because any decent person would have done the same. His voice carried conviction born from a lifetime of working-class pride, of standing on his own 2 feet, of never asking for handouts or expecting the world to owe him anything. Catherine had expected exactly this response. In fact, watching Tom's instant refusal, seeing the genuine discomfort cross his weathered face, confirmed everything she'd come to believe about his character over the past 3 days. A subtle smile touched her lips. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but insistent. She told Tom that she understood his reluctance, that she respected it even, but he was misunderstanding her intention. This wasn't about paying him off or discharging some debt she owed. It wasn't a transaction. It was about recognizing genuine character in a world where such character had become rare and precious. It was about honoring someone who embodied values that mattered. She needed him to understand that distinction. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tight, clearly struggling with the conversation. Catherine changed tactics slightly. She asked him about his life, really asked, with genuine curiosity in her voice. What did he do beyond his work at the school? What made him happy? What did he dream about when he let himself dream? Tom was reluctant to share, uncomfortable talking about himself, but Catherine's patient attention gradually drew him out. He told her about Sarah, his voice softening when he spoke her name, about how cancer had taken her 3 years ago after 25 years of marriage, about the medical bills that had buried him in debt he was still climbing out from under, about his 2 jobs, the warehouse and the school, the constant exhaustion that had become so normal he barely noticed it anymore, about his small studio apartment with the broken lamp and the leaking faucet he kept meaning to fix, about how he sent money each month to his sister whose husband had left her with 3 kids. His life, laid out plainly, was one of struggle and sacrifice and quiet endurance. Then, almost embarrassed, he mentioned a dream he'd carried for years. He'd always wanted to open a small community center in his neighborhood, a place where kids could go after school for tutoring and activities, where they'd be safe and supported. So many children in his area had nowhere to go. Parents working multiple jobs, no money for programs or activities. He'd seen too many bright kids slip through the cracks, get involved with the wrong crowds, waste their potential. A community center could change that, but it was just a dream, he said quickly, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. Something he'd thought about but never had the resources to pursue. Dreams didn't pay bills. Catherine listened to every word with complete focus, her expression softening with each detail Tom shared. She saw the man beneath the uniform, the pain and the hope and the deep well of kindness that motivated everything he did. Emma, who'd been sitting quietly beside her mother, suddenly interrupted. Her young voice was clear and certain. She told Tom that he was nice like her grandpa was, that he had the same kind eyes and gentle voice, that Grandpa had always helped people too. Catherine's eyes immediately glistened with tears. She reached over and took Emma's hand, squeezing it gently. Then she looked at Tom, and her voice trembled slightly when she spoke. She told him her father had passed away 2 years ago. Richard Hayes, the man who'd built Hayes Industries from a single construction company into what it was today. He'd died suddenly of a heart attack at 68, and Catherine had inherited not just a company but an impossible legacy to uphold. Her father had believed deeply that wealth was responsibility, that success meant lifting others up, that business should serve communities, not just shareholders. Since his death, Catherine had been searching for meaning in her work, trying to honor what he'd taught her but feeling increasingly lost. She ran the company competently, made the right strategic decisions, maintained profitability. But it all felt hollow, mechanical, disconnected from any real purpose. She'd been going through the motions of a powerful life while feeling emptier each day. Then she'd met Tom, and something had shifted. Seeing his courage, his selflessness, his genuine goodness, had reminded her of what her father had tried to teach her, that the most important things in life had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share. That character mattered more than wealth, that helping people, really helping them in direct and meaningful ways, was the only thing that gave success any real value. Tom had reignited something in her that had been dying since her father's death, a sense of purpose, a connection to what truly mattered. And now, hearing about his dream for a community center, she saw an opportunity not just to help him, but to honor her father's memory and maybe, finally, find the meaning she'd been desperately searching for. Catherine took a deep breath and laid out her proposal with the precision of someone who'd spent the past 3 days planning every detail. Hayes Industries had a charitable foundation, she explained, one that distributed millions of dollars every year to various causes. But it had become impersonal, sterile even, managed by committees and boards who approved grants for organizations they'd never visited, people they'd never met, numbers on spreadsheets, tax deductions. Good optics for shareholders. She hated it. She wanted to change that, to make the foundation's work direct and meaningful again. And Tom had given her the perfect opportunity. She proposed funding his community center completely, not as charity, but as a true partnership. Tom would run it, design it, make every decision about what programs it offered and who it served. He would build it from the ground up according to his vision, the one he'd carried in his heart for years. Hayes Industries would provide the building, the renovations, the equipment, the operating budget, everything needed to make it not just functional, but excellent. Tom would be the director, with a salary that reflected the importance of the work. Additionally, she wanted to establish a scholarship program in his name, the Tom Miller Scholarship Fund, for children from low-income families who dreamed of college but had no means to get there. It would start with 10 full scholarships annually and grow from there. Tom felt like the air had been sucked from the room. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. He shook his head, the words tumbling out in a rush. It was too much. Way too much. He couldn't accept something like that. It wasn't right. He didn't deserve it. He'd done one decent thing, and she was offering him a whole new life. The proportions were all wrong. He kept shaking his head, kept protesting, his voice rising slightly with distress. Catherine's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears and her voice shook when she spoke. She told Tom that he didn't understand, that he couldn't see what she saw. For the past 2 years, since her father had died, she'd been lost, going through the motions, running a company, making money, but feeling empty, purposeless, disconnected from anything that mattered. Her father had built Hayes Industries from nothing, had always believed that wealth was a tool for doing good, for lifting up others. When he died, she'd inherited everything but had lost the sense of purpose that should have come with it. The foundation had become just another corporate obligation, writing checks without connection, helping people she'd never meet. It had all felt hollow. Then Tom had appeared in that parking lot. Not a calculated business move, not a strategic decision, just pure instinctual courage and goodness. He'd reminded her what her father had always tried to teach her, that the measure of a person isn't their bank account or their title, but their character and their actions. Tom had shown her something she desperately needed to see, that there were still people in the world who acted from genuine kindness, who risked everything for strangers, who lived with integrity even when no one was watching. She told him through her tears that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to honor the people who truly made the world better, that she needed to do this as much as he needed to receive it, that this wasn't about paying a debt but about creating something meaningful together, about channeling resources towards someone who would use them to change lives. She needed this partnership, needed to be part of something real and good, needed to feel connected to her father's legacy again. Emma suddenly spoke up, her young voice cutting through the emotion in the room. She told Tom that her mommy had been sad since Grandpa died. Really sad, even when she smiled. But last night, talking about this plan, her mommy had smiled for real. The kind of smile Emma remembered from before. Tom looked at Emma, then back at Catherine. He saw the tears streaming down her face, saw the raw vulnerability, saw past the expensive suit and the CEO title to the grieving daughter and struggling mother underneath. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the desperate hope, the genuine need. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about a billionaire throwing money at a problem. This was about 2 broken people trying to find meaning and purpose in a world that had taken so much from both of them. His protest died in his throat. Tom sat in that conference room, his entire world tilting on its axis, and felt torn completely in half. One part of him, the part that had been shaped by 53 years of working-class pride, wanted to stand up and politely refuse. He'd never taken a handout in his life, never accepted welfare even when money was so tight after Sarah's medical bills that he'd eaten nothing but rice and beans for 2 months straight. He'd worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs when necessary, always paid his own way, always stood on his own feet. Accepting something this enormous felt like admitting he couldn't make it on his own, like becoming someone he'd never wanted to be. But another part of him, a quieter part that had grown over years of watching neighborhood kids with nowhere to go after school, of seeing potential wasted because of circumstance rather than ability, he recognized that this wasn't really about him at all. This was about those kids, about the single mothers working 2 jobs who couldn't afford after-school care, about the teenagers with no safe place to study or dream or become who they were meant to be. His pride was nothing compared to that. Catherine watched the war playing out across his face. She'd seen enough negotiations to recognize internal struggle. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. She told him he didn't need to decide right now. This was too big, too important to rush. He should take time to think about it, really think about it, and then let her know. She gave him her personal cell phone number, written on a business card that felt heavy as gold in his rough hand. Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and left the conference room feeling like he was walking through a dream. The next week was the longest of Tom's life. He went through his routines mechanically, mopping floors without seeing them, emptying trash cans on autopilot. His mind churned constantly. He barely slept. On Wednesday evening, he drove to Riverside Cemetery, where Sarah was buried under a simple granite headstone that had taken him a year to pay off. He knelt on the grass, ignoring the dampness seeping through his work pants, and talked to her the way he'd done countless times since her death. He told her everything, about the attack, about Catherine and Emma, about the offer that seemed too impossible to be real. He asked her what she would think, what she would want him to do. The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, and Tom closed his eyes, remembering. Sarah had been a librarian's assistant, a job that paid almost nothing, but that she'd loved with her whole heart. Even during her illness, even when the chemotherapy left her so weak she could barely stand. She'd volunteered reading to children during story hour. She'd believed that the most important thing anyone could do was help others, especially children. She'd always said that kids didn't choose the circumstances they were born into, but with the right support they could transcend anything. Tom remembered her reading to those children with a scarf covering her bald head, her voice steady and warm despite the pain she must have been feeling. He remembered how her face had lit up when a struggling reader finally decoded a difficult word. How she'd celebrated every small victory like it was a miracle. She'd wanted to do more, to create programs and opportunities, but they'd never had the resources. She'd died with those dreams unfulfilled. Tom opened his eyes and looked at her headstone. Sarah Miller, beloved wife. She made the world kinder. He realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that accepting Catherine's offer wasn't about him at all. It was about honoring Sarah's spirit. It was about finally making real the dreams she'd carried. It was about using an unexpected opportunity to help the children she'd loved so much. His pride, his discomfort, his working-class reluctance to accept help, all of that was just ego. What mattered was the work, the impact, the lives that could be changed. Sarah would have told him to stop being stubborn and say yes. She would have been furious if he let pride stand in the way of helping people who needed it. Tom pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed the number on Catherine's business card. She answered on the second ring, her voice tentative and hopeful. Tom took a deep breath and told her yes. He accepted. He wanted to be her partner in this. He wanted to build something that would matter. Catherine's joy came through the phone so powerfully that Tom felt it in his chest. Her voice broke as she thanked him, as she told him this meant everything to her. They arranged to meet the following Saturday to begin discussing details. When Tom hung up, he sat by Sarah's grave for another hour, feeling her presence around him like a warm blanket, feeling certain for the first time in 3 years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the following weeks, Tom's life transformed in ways he'd never imagined. He and Catherine met regularly, sometimes at Hayes Industries headquarters in a glass tower downtown that made Tom dizzy when he looked down from the 40th floor conference room. Other times at coffee shops where Catherine wore jeans and a simple sweater, and nobody recognized her as one of the state's wealthiest people. What had started as business meetings about budgets and timelines and architectural plans slowly evolved into something neither of them had expected. Genuine friendship. Catherine insisted on involving Tom in every single decision about the community center. They visited potential locations together, walking through abandoned buildings and empty lots, imagining what could be. Tom would point out which neighborhoods needed it most, where kids currently had nowhere to go, where families struggled. Catherine would take notes on her phone, ask questions, really listen to his answers. She treated him as an equal partner, never talking down, never dismissing his ideas because he lacked a business degree or corporate experience. When Tom suggested the center needed a full kitchen so they could provide hot meals to kids who might not eat dinner otherwise, Catherine immediately added it to the plans. When he worried about making the space welcoming rather than institutional, she hired a design firm and insisted Tom lead the meetings. His opinion mattered. His vision shaped everything. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But more than the business discussions, Tom found himself seeing beyond Catherine's powerful exterior to the person underneath. She was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. She was surrounded by people constantly, assistants and executives and board members, but isolated by her position. During their fourth meeting, sitting in a small cafe while rain drummed against the windows, Catherine's professional mask slipped. She started talking about her father, about how he'd built Hayes Industries from a single construction company into the empire it was today. Her voice grew soft with grief. He'd died suddenly 2 years ago, a heart attack at 68, and she'd inherited everything without warning. She'd been groomed for leadership but not prepared for the loneliness of it. Every decision she made affected thousands of employees and their families. The pressure was crushing. She lay awake most nights, running numbers and scenarios, terrified of failing, of destroying what her father had built. Tom listened without interrupting, the way he'd learned to listen during Sarah's illness, when sometimes she'd just needed him to be present. When Catherine finished, her eyes bright with unshed tears, Tom spoke quietly. He told her about the warehouse job he'd worked for 15 years, how the manager had been obsessed with quarterly numbers and efficiency metrics, how he'd treated workers like interchangeable parts, but there'd been a floor supervisor named Marcus who'd remembered everyone's names, who'd asked about their kids and their lives, who'd helped cover shifts when someone had a family emergency. When Marcus retired, over 200 people showed up to his party. When the manager left, nobody noticed. Tom said he didn't know anything about running a billion-dollar company, but he knew that people remembered how you made them feel. Numbers on spreadsheets weren't legacy. The lives you touched were. Catherine stared at him like he'd revealed some profound secret. Over subsequent meetings, she opened up more. She talked about her fears of raising Emma in a world of privilege, of her daughter growing up entitled and disconnected from reality. She worried Emma would never have real friendships, that everyone would want something from her because of her name and wealth. She confided that since her father's death, she'd felt adrift, going through the motions but feeling no real joy or purpose. Work was obligation. Success was hollow. Even her home, a sprawling estate with 12 bedrooms, felt empty and cold. Tom shared his own experiences, his wisdom born from years of modest living. He talked about how he and Sarah had been happy in their tiny apartment because they'd had each other. How the best moments of his life had cost nothing, sitting on their fire escape on summer evenings watching the sunset, holding hands while they walked through the park, laughing over meals of pasta and cheap wine. He told Catherine that joy wasn't found in things but in connections, in presence, in appreciating small, perfect moments, that Emma wouldn't remember the size of her house or the price of her toys, but she'd remember time spent together, attention given freely, love expressed consistently. Catherine absorbed his words like someone dying of thirst. She told him his perspective was refreshing, grounding, completely different from everyone else in her world who measured everything in dollar signs and market share. Tom made her remember what actually mattered, made her feel less alone. She started bringing Emma to some of their meetings, and Tom watched how the little girl lit up exploring potential center locations, asking if other kids would really get to come there, if they'd be happy. He saw how Catherine smiled at her daughter with such fierce love it made his chest ache. They were finding their way, mother and daughter, and somehow Tom had become part of that journey. The community center project moved forward with remarkable speed once Tom and Catherine committed fully. Catherine dedicated not just significant resources, but the full weight of Hayes Industries' reputation and connections. Architects who normally designed luxury hotels found themselves touring struggling neighborhoods with Tom, listening as he explained what families actually needed. Interior designers, accustomed to marble and gold leaf, learned about durable, welcoming spaces that could withstand hundreds of energetic children. Contractors who'd built corporate headquarters were briefed on creating something meaningful rather than merely impressive. Tom was in the middle of all of it. No longer a janitor, but a vital voice in every planning session. He walked construction sites in a borrowed hard hat, pointing out where the tutoring rooms should have better lighting, where the gymnasium needed more storage for equipment, and where the kitchen should be positioned so kids wouldn't feel like they were in a cafeteria line. The architects and designers initially seemed puzzled by his input. This thin man in worn jeans without a college degree, but they quickly learned he understood the project's heart in ways their expertise couldn't match. Local news picked up the story, and it spread beyond the neighborhood. Television crews filmed Tom and Catherine touring the construction site together. Newspapers ran features with headlines like "Unlikely Partners Building Hope" and "From Parking Lot Heroes to Community Champions." The media framed it as a beautiful modern fairy tale, the billionaire CEO and the school janitor united by crisis, and now creating something transformative together. Tom hated the attention. Cameras made him stammer and freeze. Reporters asked questions that made him uncomfortable, trying to get him to say something dramatic about class differences or sudden wealth. But Catherine handled it all with practiced grace. She redirected every question, deflected praise toward Tom's vision, insisted repeatedly that this was his dream and she was privileged to help make it real. She never let the media paint her as a savior or benefactor. She called herself a partner and meant it. Emma accompanied her mother to meetings more and more often as weeks passed. The little girl had been frightened for days after the attack, suffering nightmares and clinging to Catherine constantly. But being involved in the center project seemed to heal something in her. She loved seeing the building take shape, loved hearing Tom talk about all the children who would come there, loved imagining the programs and activities. She started drawing pictures of what she thought the center should look like, elaborate crayon creations that Tom always studied seriously and praised genuinely. Emma grew deeply attached to Tom in a way that surprised everyone, including him. She gravitated toward him at meetings, sitting beside him while adults discussed budgets and timelines, asking him questions about everything. Did he like butterflies? What was his favorite color? Did he know any good jokes? Tom answered each question with patience and warmth, finding himself caring deeply for this bright, kind-hearted child who saw the world with such hope despite the trauma she'd experienced. Catherine noticed and quietly explained to Tom one evening that Emma reminded her of her own father. The same gentle steadiness, the same careful attention, the same way of making her feel safe and valued. Tom felt the weight of that comparison, the responsibility and the honor of it. One afternoon in early December, they were all at the construction site, bundled in coats against the cold. Emma was showing Tom another drawing she'd made, this one of him surrounded by smiling children. Tom knelt down to her level to see it better, praising the colors she'd chosen, the details she'd included. Emma looked at him with sudden seriousness, her young face thoughtful beyond her years. She asked if he would be her friend forever. Not just for the project, but really forever. Tom felt something crack open in his chest. He looked into those trusting eyes and thought about his own life, about loneliness and loss, and the unexpected ways people came into your world and changed everything. He told Emma solemnly that yes, he would be her friend forever. He promised. Emma threw her small arms around his neck and hugged him tight. Tom hugged her back carefully, his weathered hands gentle on her small back, and felt tears prick at his own eyes. When Emma released him and ran off to explore more of the construction site with one of the architects who'd volunteered to watch her, Tom looked up to find Catherine standing a few feet away. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. She told him quietly that Emma hadn't been this happy, this secure, since her grandfather died. That Tom had given her daughter something precious, someone trustworthy and kind in a world that had recently shown its dangerous side. That she was grateful beyond words. Tom didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his own throat too tight for speech, and understood that he'd somehow become part of this family in ways that had nothing to do with business partnerships or community centers, and everything to do with human connection that transcended wealth and status and every artificial divide. 6 months after that cold November night in the parking lot, the community center opened its doors. The building stood 3 stories tall on what had been an abandoned lot in the heart of the neighborhood Tom had called home his entire life. Red brick and large windows, welcoming rather than institutional, with a mural on the front wall painted by local teenagers depicting children of all backgrounds reaching toward a bright Sunday. Inside was everything Tom had dreamed of, and more. Tutoring rooms with individual desks and bookshelves already stocked with materials. A library with comfortable reading chairs and a children's section full of colorful picture books. A full-sized gymnasium with new basketball hoops and gleaming wooden floors, art rooms with easels and paint supplies. music spaces with donated instruments, a commercial kitchen where hot meals would be served every afternoon, computer labs with brand new equipment. It was beautiful and functional and real, no longer just a dream but an actual place where actual children would come and grow and thrive. The opening ceremony took place on a warm Saturday in May. Tom stood near the front entrance in a new suit that Catherine had insisted on buying him, though he'd argued about it for 20 minutes. He felt stiff and uncomfortable in the unfamiliar clothing, kept tugging at the tie around his neck. His palms were sweating. His heart raced. Hundreds of people filled the street and parking lot, far more than he'd expected. Community members, families with children who'd already enrolled in programs, local politicians and school board members, reporters with cameras, and Hayes Industries employees who'd volunteered to help staff the center. Folding chairs faced a small stage with a podium. A ribbon stretched across the entrance, waiting to be cut. Tom felt overwhelmed by the size of it all, by how many lives were about to be touched by something that had started as an impossible dream. Catherine took the podium first, elegant in a simple dress, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. She welcomed everyone and explained what this center meant. Then she turned and looked directly at Tom. She called him her hero, not just for saving her life 6 months ago, but for showing her what true character looked like. She told the crowd that Tom's courage and selflessness had inspired this entire project, that his vision for helping children and families had shaped every decision. She explained that Tom Miller represented the best of humanity, the kind of person who acted without expectation of reward, who saw need and responded with kindness, who dedicated his life to serving others even when no one noticed or cared. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke, and she made no effort to hide the tears on her face. The crowd applauded, and Tom felt his face burn with embarrassment and something deeper he couldn't name. Then Catherine called him to the podium, and he had no choice but to stand on shaking legs and walk to the microphone. Looking out at hundreds of faces, at families and children and neighbors, Tom's mind went blank with terror. He'd never been good with public speaking, had never wanted to be in front of crowds. His hands gripped the podium edge, and he took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was rough but genuine. He told them he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd been given an incredible gift, the chance to do something meaningful. He dedicated the center to his late wife Sarah, whose dream had always been to help children reach their potential, regardless of circumstance. He thanked Catherine not just for her funding but for her friendship, for treating him as an equal, for trusting his vision when she could have easily done this her own way. He told the crowd that this center represented what was possible when people from different worlds, different backgrounds, different circumstances recognized their shared humanity. That wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts but in the lives touched and the good done. That every person mattered, every child deserved opportunity, every family deserved support. His voice grew stronger as he spoke from the heart. He told them this was their center, that it belonged to the community, that it existed to serve them. The crowd rose to their feet as one, applauding so loudly it echoed off the surrounding buildings. Tom stood at the podium, tears streaming down his weathered face, completely overwhelmed. When he stepped away, Catherine met him and pulled him into a tight embrace. She whispered in his ear that he'd changed her life more than he could possibly know, that he'd given her purpose and meaning, and reminded her what her father had tried to teach her, that she would be forever grateful. Tom hugged her back, this woman who'd become family, and let himself cry for everything lost and everything found. Emma came running up then, and Tom bent down to scoop her into his arms. She kissed his cheek and told him she loved him. Tom held her close and told her he loved her too. And standing there with Catherine and Emma, surrounded by community members celebrating hope and possibility, Tom Miller knew with absolute certainty that his life had meaning, that Sarah would be proud, and that sometimes the worst moments led to the most beautiful transformations. The center thrived beyond anyone's expectations. Within weeks of opening, every program was full with waiting lists growing daily. Children poured through the doors every afternoon, their backpacks bouncing, their voices filling the halls with laughter and energy. Tom managed it all, having left both his janitor position and the warehouse job behind. He'd worried he wouldn't know how to lead, that his lack of education or management experience would show, but he discovered something surprising about himself. He was a natural leader, not the corporate type who commanded through authority and hierarchy, but the kind who led through genuine care and connection. He knew every child's name within the first week, knew their struggles and their strengths. He walked the halls greeting families, asking about homework and soccer games and sick grandmothers. He sat with struggling readers and celebrated when they finished a difficult chapter. He mediated conflicts between teenagers and encouraged shy kids to try the art program. He hired staff who shared his values. People from the neighborhood who understood these families because they were these families. The center felt less like an institution and more like an extension of home, warm and welcoming and safe. Everyone who walked through the doors felt it. Catherine visited regularly, often bringing Emma after school. She'd started volunteering in the reading program on Thursday evenings, sitting in the children's library with a group of second graders, helping them sound out words and discover stories. Tom watched her during these sessions, saw how she smiled genuinely when a child succeeded, how she listened patiently when they talked about their lives, how she treated each child like they mattered. The families and staff never saw her as Catherine Hayes, billionaire CEO. They saw her as Miss Catherine, the nice lady who read stories and remembered their names, and always had encouraging words. She blended in. Just another volunteer, and she seemed lighter for it. Tom noticed a profound change in Catherine over those months. The sadness that had clouded her green eyes since he'd first met her, the weight she'd carried like a physical burden, had lifted. She laughed more easily, smiled more often. Her movements seemed less measured, less careful, as if she'd stopped performing the role of powerful executive and started simply being herself. She was more present, more genuinely engaged, whether she was in the center's library reading to children or in a Hayes Industries boardroom making million-dollar decisions. She'd found something she'd been missing, and it showed in everything about her. One Thursday evening in late summer, after the reading program ended and the last families had gone home, Tom and Catherine sat together in the empty center's common area. The cleaning crew had already been through. The building was quiet. Except for the hum of the air conditioning, they each held paper cups of coffee from the kitchen, sitting in mismatched comfortable chairs they'd picked out together during the design phase. The windows showed the neighborhood darkening into evening, streetlights flickering on one by one. Catherine was quiet for a long time, just sipping her coffee and looking around the space they'd created together. Then she spoke softly, her voice reflective. She admitted she'd been lost before meeting Tom. Completely lost, though she'd hidden it well. She'd been going through the motions of her powerful life, running her company, making decisions that affected thousands of people, attending galas and board meetings and shareholder presentations. From the outside, she'd looked successful and confident and in control. But inside, she'd felt empty, hollow, like she was playing a part in someone else's story. Her father's death had taken not just a parent but her sense of purpose. She'd been maintaining what he'd built, but not understanding why it mattered. Tom listened without interrupting, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Catherine continued, her eyes bright with emotion. She said that Tom had shown her what truly mattered. Not the quarterly reports or stock prices or board approval ratings, not the size of her wealth or the reach of her influence. What mattered was connection, impact, presence. It was the look on a child's face when they finally understood a math problem. It was the gratitude in a mother's eyes when she had a safe place for her kids after school. It was the simple joy of reading a story to children who hung on every word. Tom had lived these truths his whole life without thinking about them, and meeting him had reminded her what her father had tried to teach her before he died. That wealth was a tool, not a destination. That power meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others up. That the best parts of being human had nothing to do with money at all. She told Tom that he'd saved her life twice, once in that parking lot, and again by showing her how to actually live. Catherine's transformation rippled outward from the community center into every aspect of her life. She restructured the entire Hayes Industries charitable foundation, scrapping the committee-based approval system that had treated philanthropy like a business transaction. Instead, she created a model focused on direct, meaningful impact. No more writing checks to organizations she'd never visited. No more funding projects based on tax advantages or public relations value. She began personally visiting nonprofits, talking to people doing work on the ground, funding initiatives that created real change, even if they didn't come with naming opportunities or gala recognition. She established a program honoring everyday heroes across the communities where Hayes Industries operated. Teachers who spent their own money on classroom supplies, nurses who stayed late to comfort frightened patients, single parents working multiple jobs to give their kids better lives. Each month, the foundation identified someone whose quiet service made their community better and provided them with meaningful support. Whether that was paying off debt, funding education, or helping them expand their impact. Catherine told Tom it felt like finally using her resources the way her father had always intended. Her relationship with Emma deepened in ways that wouldn't have seemed possible before. Catherine began saying no to business meetings that conflicted with Emma's activities. She attended school plays and soccer games. She instituted a no-phones rule during dinner, during which they talked about their days. Really talked, sharing hopes and fears and silly observations. She took Emma camping despite having never slept in a tent in her life, and they laughed themselves sick trying to start a campfire. Emma blossomed under this attention, becoming more confident and joyful. Catherine told Tom that she'd been so afraid of failing as a mother, of raising a child disconnected from reality. But now she felt like they were finding their way together. Tom watched all these changes with quiet pride. He never took credit, never pointed out that he'd influenced them. But he felt deep satisfaction seeing Catherine become more fully herself. Their friendship had been mutually transformative in ways neither had anticipated. Catherine had given him the means to serve his community, to honor Sarah's memory, to do work that mattered. But he'd given her something perhaps more valuable: perspective, purpose. A reminder that life's meaning wasn't found in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in human connection and service. They'd saved each other in different ways, and both of them knew it. One crisp October afternoon, a year after the center's opening, Catherine asked Tom to meet her at Hayes Industries headquarters. He rode the elevator to the 40th floor, still slightly awed by the gleaming glass and steel despite having been there dozens of times. Catherine met him at the elevator with an expression he couldn't quite read, excitement mixed with nervousness. She led him to her office, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She asked him to sit, then remained standing herself, too energized to settle. She told him she had big news. The Hayes Industries Board of Directors had met the previous week to review the community center initiative. They'd examined the metrics, the impact data, the community feedback, the cost-benefit analysis. But more than the numbers, they'd been moved by the stories. By the single mother who'd been able to accept a promotion because she finally had reliable after-school care, by the teenager who discovered a love of coding in the computer lab and earned a scholarship to college, by the elementary student whose reading scores had jumped 2 grade levels after just 6 months of tutoring. The board had been inspired, transformed even. They'd voted unanimously to approve funding for 10 more centers in underserved neighborhoods across the state. It was a massive expansion, a commitment of tens of millions of dollars over 5 years. They wanted to replicate what Tom and Catherine had built, to bring that same impact to communities struggling with poverty and lack of resources. But they'd been clear about one thing: they wanted Tom to oversee the entire initiative. Catherine's voice grew more excited as she explained. The board had created a new position specifically for him: Director of Community Engagement for Hayes Industries. He would lead the development of all 10 centers, hire and train local directors for each, ensure they remain true to the mission and values of the original. He'd have a staff, a substantial budget, decision-making authority. The salary would be more than comfortable, with benefits and resources to travel between locations. He'd be shaping how one of the largest companies in the state approached community investment and social responsibility. Tom sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. From school janitor to director of a statewide initiative seemed impossible, like a story someone would make up. But Catherine was looking at him with absolute certainty, and he realized she'd probably been instrumental in making this happen. Tom sat in Catherine's office, stunned into complete silence. The magnitude of what she was proposing felt impossible to grasp. Just 18 months ago, he'd been mopping floors in an elementary school, invisible to almost everyone around him, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over his head. Now, Catherine was offering him a position that would make him responsible for shaping community investment across an entire state, with resources and authority he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. The leap seemed too vast, the distance between who he'd been and who they wanted him to become unbridgeable. He told Catherine hesitantly that he didn't have the qualifications, the education, the experience for something like this. Catherine sat on the edge of her desk, looking at him directly. She told him that was exactly why he was perfect for the role. Business school graduates could analyze spreadsheets and project returns on investment, but they couldn't understand what it felt like to choose between rent and groceries, to work until your body screamed in protest, to watch your neighbors struggle with systems designed to keep them struggling. Tom understood these communities because he'd lived their reality. He knew what they needed because he'd needed it himself. He'd proven at the first center that he could lead with both competence and compassion. The board trusted him. She trusted him. He just needed to trust himself. Tom asked for time to think about it. Catherine agreed immediately, though he could see the hope in her eyes. Over the next week, Tom wrestled with the decision in a way that felt different from when she'd first proposed the community center. That had been about serving others. This felt more personal, more about his own life changing in fundamental ways. He talked to the center's staff, to families who used the programs, to his few remaining friends from his warehouse days. Everyone told him he'd be crazy not to accept. Finally, he made his decision. He called Catherine and told her yes. He'd accept the position. He'd do his best to honor the trust they were placing in him. Catherine's joy came through the phone like sunshine. His new position came with a substantial salary, more money than Tom had ever imagined earning. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. He could afford more than just survival. After much searching, he moved out of his small studio apartment into a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. A 2-bedroom bungalow with a small yard and a porch where he could sit in the evenings. It felt enormous compared to what he'd had, though it was probably the smallest house on the block. He bought furniture slowly, carefully, choosing comfort over style. But despite the changes in his circumstances, Tom remained fundamentally unchanged in his character. He still wore simple clothes, jeans, and plain shirts, work boots that were practical rather than fashionable. He still drove his old truck, the same one he'd had for 12 years, despite Catherine teasing him that he could afford something newer. He still treated everyone with the same kindness and respect he always had, from corporate executives to the teenagers who helped clean the community center after hours. Money hadn't changed who he was at his core. It had just given him more resources to do the work that mattered. The original community center held a small ceremony to commemorate the journey that had started everything. They unveiled a bronze plaque in the entrance hall, positioned where everyone who walked through the doors would see it. The plaque showed the date of that November night and bore a simple inscription that Tom had helped write. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it." Below that, it named both Tom and Catherine, acknowledging their partnership. Tom stood with Catherine and Emma at the unveiling, surrounded by families and staff and community members, and felt the weight of how far they'd all come. That evening, Tom drove to Riverside Cemetery as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He knelt by Sarah's grave, his knees protesting, but his heart full. He told her everything, about the new position, about the 10 centers they'd build, about how her dream of helping children was expanding beyond anything they'd imagined during their years together. He told her about Catherine and Emma, about the unexpected family he'd found, about how a single moment of courage had transformed not just his life, but so many others. The wind rustled through the oak trees and Tom closed his eyes, feeling Sarah's presence as clearly as if she stood beside him. He felt her approval, her joy, her pride. He told her he missed her every day but that he was finally okay, finally living a life that mattered, finally honoring everything she'd taught him about kindness and service and love. When he opened his eyes, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Tom stood slowly, touched the cold granite of her headstone one last time, and walked back to his truck. He had work to do, communities to serve, lives to change. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly and completely alive. 2 years after that cold November night in the parking lot, the initiative had grown beyond anyone's initial vision. 15 community centers now operated across the state, each one adapted to its specific neighborhood's needs, but all sharing the same core values of dignity, accessibility, and genuine care. Thousands of families passed through their doors each week. Children received tutoring and hot meals. Teenagers found mentorship and job training. Parents accessed resources for everything from housing assistance to English classes. The impact rippled outward, changing entire communities in measurable ways. Graduation rates rose, youth crime dropped, families stabilized. Tom traveled constantly between locations, his weathered face becoming familiar to communities from the industrial towns in the north to the agricultural regions in the south. He spent days at each center, meeting with local directors, sitting in on programs, talking to families about what was working and what needed improvement. He never arrived with corporate authority or demanded changes from above. Instead, he listened, learned, and gently guided. Staff and families trusted him because he was one of them. Because he remembered what it felt like to struggle, because he treated everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances. His authenticity was his greatest strength. Tom had become something he'd never expected or sought. A quiet advocate for the working poor. Organizations invited him to speak at conferences about community development and poverty solutions. Universities asked him to sit on panels about effective philanthropy. Politicians sought his input on social programs. Tom always felt uncomfortable with these invitations, still seeing himself as just a former janitor who'd gotten lucky. But Catherine encouraged him, reminding him that his perspective was exactly what these conversations needed. So he spoke, always plainly and honestly, about real solutions rooted in dignity rather than charity, about listening to communities rather than imposing solutions, about recognizing that poor people weren't broken and didn't need fixing but rather needed resources and opportunities. Catherine attended many of these events, sitting in audiences or on panels beside him. She always introduced Tom with unmistakable pride in her voice, calling him her partner and friend, crediting him with teaching her what truly mattered. Their partnership had become somewhat legendary in philanthropic and business circles, held up as an example of what was possible when people from vastly different worlds collaborated with mutual respect. Skeptics had initially dismissed it as a publicity stunt, but the genuine friendship between them was impossible to fake. Anyone who saw them together recognized something real and rare. Emma, now 9 years old and growing tall, volunteered at the original center during summer breaks. She'd started in the reading program, sitting with groups of younger children and helping them sound out words, encouraging them through difficult passages. Tom watched her during these sessions and saw Sarah in every patient explanation, every celebration of a child's success. Emma had Sarah's gift for making children feel valued and capable. Catherine told Tom that Emma talked constantly about expanding the center's reach, about ways to help more families, about her dreams of continuing this work when she grew up. The little girl who'd run terrified through a school hallway had become a young person who believed she could change the world. Tom and Catherine spoke almost daily, phone calls that had become as natural as breathing. Sometimes they discussed business, decisions about the centers or new initiatives Catherine was considering at Hayes Industries. But more often, they shared personal updates. Tom told Catherine about the new director in the northern region who was doing extraordinary work, or about the teenager at the original center who'd just been accepted to engineering school. Catherine shared her concerns about Emma starting at a new school or her excitement about finally taking a real vacation rather than working through every holiday. They celebrated each other's victories and provided comfort during struggles. Their friendship had deepened into something that felt like family, chosen rather than born into, but no less meaningful. At a gala honoring community leadership, Catherine gave a speech that brought many in the audience to tears. She spoke about how 2 years earlier she'd been successful by every external measure, but hollow inside, going through motions without meaning. Then she'd met Tom Miller, first in a moment of terror that could have ended her life, and then through a partnership that had given her life new purpose. She told the audience that Tom had saved her in ways that had nothing to do with that November night. He'd saved her from emptiness, from disconnection, from a life measured only in profit margins and stock prices. He'd shown her what her father had tried to teach her, that wealth's only real value was its capacity to serve others, that success meant nothing without human connection, that the best parts of being alive were free and available to everyone regardless of bank account balance. Tom sat at a table near the front, uncomfortable in his formal suit, wiping tears from his weathered face. When Catherine finished speaking and the audience stood to applaud, she looked directly at him and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Tom nodded, his heart too full for any other response, and understood that saving each other was what people did when they truly cared, that crisis could forge bonds stronger than any forged in comfort, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships became the most essential ones. 3 years after that November night, the state capitol building hosted a ceremony honoring community leadership and humanitarian service. The marble halls echoed with voices and footsteps as hundreds gathered in the main reception room beneath crystal chandeliers and portraits of past governors. Tom stood backstage in yet another uncomfortable suit, his palms sweating, his heart racing the way it always did before public appearances. He'd been told the governor himself would present the award, that there would be speeches and press coverage, that this was a significant honor. Tom still felt like an imposter, like someone would eventually realize he was just a former janitor who'd stumbled into an extraordinary situation. Catherine found him backstage, Emma beside her as always. Catherine squeezed his hand and told him to breathe, to just speak from his heart the way he always did. Emma hugged him and whispered that she was proud of him. Their presence calmed him enough that when his name was called, he managed to walk onto the stage without stumbling. The governor, a silver-haired man with a politician's practiced smile, shook Tom's hand and presented him with a crystal award engraved with words. Tom couldn't quite read through his nervousness. The governor spoke about Tom's contributions, about the 15 centers serving thousands of families, about his advocacy for the working poor, about how one man's courage had sparked a movement of compassionate action. Then Tom stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd that filled the reception room. He saw Catherine and Emma in the front row, both smiling at him with love and pride. He saw directors from various centers, staff members who'd traveled hours to attend. He saw families from the communities they served, parents and children whose lives had been touched by the work. He saw business leaders and politicians and reporters, all watching him expectantly. Tom's prepared remarks, written on cards in his pocket, suddenly felt wrong. He set them aside and spoke from his heart. He told them about that November night, about hearing Emma's scream, about the choice he'd faced in that moment between safety and courage. He said he wasn't special, wasn't naturally brave, had been terrified, but he'd chosen to act despite the fear because a child needed help, because someone was in danger, because it was the right thing to do. He spoke about how that single moment of choosing courage over comfort had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events he never could have predicted. He acknowledged Catherine's extraordinary generosity, her partnership, her willingness to invest not just money but herself into this work. But he emphasized that real change hadn't come from wealth alone. It had come from recognizing their shared humanity across all divides of wealth and status and background, from seeing each other as equals despite their vastly different circumstances, from understanding that every person, regardless of their bank account or job title, had equal worth and dignity. He told the audience that the world was full of people who needed help, full of moments where someone had to choose between looking away and stepping forward. He encouraged everyone to be the person who acted when others looked away, to be the one who chose courage, to recognize that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about small moments of choosing right over easy. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. the nervousness falling away. As Tom finished and stepped back from the podium, the crowd rose as one. The applause started as a wave and built to something overwhelming, echoing off the marble walls and high ceilings. Tom stood frozen, tears streaming down his weathered face, completely overwhelmed by the response. Catherine and Emma came onto the stage, both crying themselves. Catherine embraced Tom tightly. This woman who'd become his closest friend, his partner in purpose, his chosen family. Emma wrapped her arms around both of them, and the three stood together in front of the applauding crowd, united by crisis and sustained by genuine love and respect. They were an unlikely family, forged in a parking lot on a cold November night, bound together by something deeper than blood or shared history. The camera capturing the event for the evening news pulled back slowly, showing the three figures embracing on the stage, the crowd applauding, the crystal chandeliers glittering overhead, a moment of pure connection and joy. And in that moment, as if stepping outside the scene itself, the truth became clear. True heroism doesn't lie in superhuman strength or fearless confidence. It lies in ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the moment demands it. It lies in choosing courage despite fear, in acting when inaction would be easier, in recognizing the humanity in strangers and responding with compassion. Wealth's only real purpose is measured not in possessions accumulated, but in lives changed, in opportunities created, in dignity restored. Money means nothing unless it serves something beyond itself, and sometimes saving someone else's life means discovering the purpose in your own. Tom Miller had run into darkness to help a stranger, never knowing that moment would save not just Catherine's life, but his own soul, would pull him from grief and give him meaning, would connect him to people who would become family. Catherine Hayes had been drowning in wealth and power, suffocating in success, until a janitor reminded her what her father had tried to teach her about what truly matters. They'd saved each other in different ways, and in doing so had created something that rippled outward, touching thousands of lives, proving that connection across divides wasn't just possible but transformative. So look around your own community. See the people who serve quietly, who show up consistently, who help without expectation of recognition, the teachers who spend their own money on supplies, the neighbors who check on the elderly, the volunteers who give their time, the workers who take pride in jobs others overlook. They are the real heroes. They are the ones who make communities work, who hold society together, who prove that goodness still exists. Recognize them, celebrate them, thank them, and when your own moment comes, when you hear someone crying for help, when you see injustice or need or suffering, be the person who acts. Be the person who runs toward the crisis instead of away from it. Be the person who chooses courage over comfort, who sees humanity over convenience, who understands that we're all connected and that every act of kindness matters. Because you never know when a single moment of courage might change everything, might save not just someone else's life, but might give meaning and purpose to your own. The world needs more Tom Millers, more people who act from pure motive, more people who see crisis and respond with compassion, more people who understand that true wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. You could be that person. You could be the one who makes the difference. All it takes is courage and the willingness to act when others look away. So when your moment comes, and it will come, choose wisely. Choose courage, choose compassion, choose to be the hero someone desperately needs, because in the end, we're all just people trying to make it through this complicated world. And sometimes the most powerful thing any of us can do is simply show up for each other when it matters most.